Today we're talking about baking. And what do you do if you don't have one or more of the ingredients that are called for? Our topic today is about advice and substitutions in baking. And stick around to the end because we're going to put on the apron and see if we can experiment with some of the advice. You're watching Fun to Know with Carol. I'm Carol, here with quick weekly videos that help interesting people like you connect with their curiosity. Now, on with the show. We're going to visit a couple of my favorite bakers. The first is a virtual visit to Gemma Stafford. Gemma's one of those bakers that I've loved for the past few years, but I've really only met her through YouTube. The thing I love about her approach is that she uses multiple ways of teaching. She's got her YouTube channel, Bigger Bolder Baking, and her website of the same name, but she gives you the recipe verbally, she shows it to you, she explains it in bullet points, she'll send you an email so that you have a hard copy. You get to watch as you follow along with her and she explains as you're going through it. It's the perfect scenario. Plus, she's just so practical and beautiful to listen to. Gemma's from Ireland and is a trained pastry chef. In fact, she and I went to the same school, the Ballymaloe Cookery School. Now, let me clarify. Gemma was trained at Ballymaloe. I went to Ballymaloe for an afternoon. There's a big difference there. So she has such a wide wealth of experience that she brings to her YouTube channel and to her cookbooks and to her blog and to her podcasts, and you get the idea, don't you? But sometimes you'll be cooking something, it'll call for, let's say, buttermilk, and you don't have any buttermilk. What do? Well, actually, Gemma has a whole list of substitutions for things like brown sugar, buttermilk, sour cream, golden syrup, corn syrup, eggs. Did you know that there were substitutes for eggs besides egg beaters? So she's got those substitutions, and I will link those in the description box below. So my first fun to know resource I want to share with you is Gemma Stafford and the Bigger Bolder Baking community. So fun. Now, bringing it a little closer to home, I have a very close friend, Rosemary, who is an excellent home baker. Rosemary makes beautiful desserts that she very generously shares with the community. So the other day, I went over to Rosemary's and asked her for her best advice, especially when you don't have exactly what's called for in the recipe. We're at the home of one of my very excellent home baker friends, and while we're waiting for her to answer the door, I'll take this opportunity to remind you to subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do that now. And if you are a new subscriber, thanks for joining us. Give your hometown a shout out in the comments below. I'd love to know where you're watching from. So I am at the home of one of my favorite and expert baker friends, Rosemary, and we're going to talk some about what she's learned over the years. And what's your favorite type of thing to bake?
Presentation cakes.
Ah, okay. So if you had some expert advice, what would that be?
Probably to make sure you do your measurements properly. You know, it's really important. This is an 8-inch pan, and I want to make the recipe for a 9-inch pan. Mm-hmm. I can't just increase it by 1/8. You really have to do it by volume.
Wow, that sounds a little complicated. I would imagine that there's something that would need to be changed with the baking times too.
Yes, baking times are critical, and it also matters how many pans you have in the oven. This is where testing your cake really comes into effect. The most common thing is if you touch the top of the cake and it bounces back, and it has also left the edges of the pan. Those are clear times that your cake is done. Do not just go by the recipe. Most people probably just assume that the oven is the right temperature. If it says 350, it's 350. So getting a good oven thermometer is key to baking.
So I'm a person who just kind of likes to wing it, though. So I do that in my cooking. If I'm making a stew, I'll just put in whatever I happen to have, and that seems to work fine for me.
Maybe for some people, if you don't really care what the end product looks like. But by and large, cooking is an art and baking is a science. My advice, especially if you're baking a recipe for the first time, follow the recipe to the dot. So make sure you bake it right the first time.
All right, well, this has been some fantastic advice, and we're going to try and put this into practice. We're going to do a little experiment. Whether winging it or following the recipe as it's written is going to be the best advice. And this little handsome devil here is our wire fox terrier, Freddie. You might see him walking around behind the scenes, so I just wanted you to be properly introduced to Freddie. Today is baking day, and we're going to put on the apron because we're going to be making some scones. This recipe came from a bed and breakfast that my husband and I stayed at in Ireland. So the measurements and temperatures are going to be in metric and American measures, but you won't have any trouble with that, I'm sure. We're going to make a couple of substitutions of ingredients just because of what I have on hand. But the main substitution that we're going to use is one related to chilling the recipe. So we're going to try a couple of different ways and see if it's really necessary to chill before baking. So let's get started, and on our way over to the ingredients, let me ask you the question of the day, and that is, what is your favorite thing to bake? Are you a bread baker, a brownie baker, a cake or pie baker? Put it in the comments below. I'd love to know what's your favorite thing to bake. Here are the ingredients we're going to be using today, including butter, which didn't quite make it into the picture, but self-rising flour, some ultrafine sugar, baking powder, cream, and milk or milk substitute, 1 egg, and a 3-inch cookie cutter. First, we'll mix our dry ingredients. We'll blend together our sugar and flour along with the baking powder. Don't forget to include a large pinch of salt to your dry mixture. Once that has been whisked together, you can add the butter. I've cubed the butter just to make it a little easier to blend in. It does take longer than it does in this fast forward video. Once the butter is included, you can add any fruit that you want to the scones. Now for our wet ingredients. You're going to mix the cream and milk together, and then 1 egg that you've whisked in advance. You put the egg in with the milk mixture, stir it thoroughly, and then add to the dry ingredients. That's all there is to it. You want to make sure that this is mixed very thoroughly so that all the flour from the bottom of the bowl has been incorporated. And then you'll turn it out onto a pastry mat or onto your kitchen counter, whichever works for you. Flour the surface so that it doesn't stick. This is a very sticky dough. And then you're simply going to pat it down. You don't need a rolling pin for this. I actually patted this down a little too thin. You could make it a bit thicker because when it comes to cutting out the cookie cutters, you really only need 9 for this recipe, or at the most 10, and I had a lot of extra dough here, so they could have been made a little bit thicker. These are the 3 that we're going to bake off right away. Into the oven they go. I set the timer. And, oops, I forgot to milk wash them, so I'm going to go back and milk wash them. And then the others that will be chilling and freezing, we will separate, and I'll package these up in plastic so they don't get freezer burned or absorb any smells. But they are put into separate packages and ready for the next day. Well, I sure enjoyed this experiment. It was fun for me to realize that substituting certain ingredients didn't really have that much of an effect on taste, and yet substituting chilling times drastically did. This was the first scone that went in immediately after mixing. I chilled for 30 minutes. You might see a huge difference, or you might not. There really was not much difference at all in the 30 minutes. However, in the frozen one, the one I froze overnight, much fluffier. So what I learned from that is that if it says chill before baking, maybe even freezing is the way to go, and then bake it off the next day. The non-scientific reason for the fact that it gets fluffier when it's chilled or frozen is because after you've manipulated the butter in the flour and you've warmed it up with your hands, what that heat does is take some of the moisture out of what normally a frozen or chilled piece of butter would have. And it's that moisture that creates steam, and the steam is what causes something to be a little fluffier. So that's my non-scientific explanation of that. I hope you've enjoyed this video and our experiment, following along with some of the advice on substitutions and to follow the recipe. I will be here again next week with a completely different topic, so I hope you'll join me. I do appreciate you, and I hope you'll take care and have a wonderful week ahead. Bye-bye.